It happened every night at Graceland, long after the crowds were gone and the lights went out. Elvis Presley stood at a single upstairs window, still as a statue, staring into the dark. People thought he was guarding his kingdom, but the truth of what he was really looking for would break your heart. It started as a rumor. Neighbors said that after midnight, a faint yellow glow could always be seen behind the right curtain of the second floor at Graceland. Some thought it was a night lamp. Others swore they could see his shadow, motionless, like he was keeping watch over something only he could see. Inside the mansion, the house was silent. The last guard shift ended at 1 a.m. The hall clock ticked softly. Upstairs, in a dimly lit room that overlooked the garden, Elvis stood by the window. He wasn't in stage clothes, just pajama pants and a robe, barefoot. The floor beneath him creaked every time he shifted his weight. He'd stand there for hours, sometimes humming, sometimes whispering words too soft for anyone to hear. The sound of cicadas drifted through the summer air. Outside, the magnolia trees swayed gently in the wind. On the road beyond the gates, a few fans lingered, holding candles, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man they called the King. They didn't know he could see them. He always could. He'd smile faintly, not because of the attention, but because it reminded him someone still waited outside, just like she once did. Then he'd grow quiet again. His hand would rest on the window frame, his thumb rubbing the wood, right on a faded mark only he noticed. A scratch from years earlier, one that looked like the letter G. The G was for Gladys. Elvis had carved it there himself in 1962, after a night when he couldn't sleep. His mother had been gone for 4 years, but grief doesn't follow a calendar. That window faced the direction of the old road where he used to see her wave as he left for tours. He'd promised he'd always wave back, even when he was famous, and he did, every night. Some nights, he'd press his palm flat against the glass, as if he could feel her through it. Other nights he'd just stare, letting memories play like old home movies in his mind. Tupelo, the small house, her laughter, the way she'd hum Peace in the Valley while folding clothes. For him, the world had never gotten louder than that silence. He told his housekeeper once, "That window's the only thing that still looks back." She didn't understand at first, but later she noticed that he never drew the curtain closed. Not once. It was like leaving a light on for someone who might come home. Sometimes, security guards heard soft piano chords drifting through the halls. Just a few notes, then quiet again. He'd been writing a melody, they said. Something unfinished. Maybe that melody wasn't meant for a record. Maybe it was for her. If you'd walked by Graceland on a summer night in 1976, you might have seen that light. You might have looked up and thought he was dreaming about the next show, or a new song, or another tour. But you'd be wrong. He wasn't thinking about the crowd. He wasn't thinking about the crown. He was thinking about a mother's voice that once told him, "Don't forget who you are, baby." And maybe that's why he stood there. Not to remember the fame, but to remember the boy who came before it. Every night, the world slept. And Elvis, the most famous man alive, stood alone with his memories, staring through glass that reflected everything he'd gained and everything he'd lost. The light behind that window never went out. Not once, but one night. Someone finally asked him why. It was a humid night in June 1976, the kind of Memphis heat that clung to your skin. The house was quiet except for the slow hum of the air conditioner and the faint creak of floorboards. Linda Thompson, Elvis's girlfriend at the time, woke to the sound of music. Not loud, just a whisper of piano notes carried through the hallway. She followed the sound barefoot, her heart beating faster with every step. At the end of the corridor, she saw him. Elvis stood in the dark, lit only by the glow from that same window. He wasn't playing the piano anymore. He was just standing there, motionless, looking out at the garden. For a moment, she watched from the doorway. He didn't move, didn't speak. just stared into the night like he was waiting for something, or someone. She finally whispered, "What are you looking at, baby?" He didn't turn around. His voice was low, almost trembling. "I'm watching for her," Linda frowned. "Her who?" He didn't answer. That silence felt heavy, like something sacred had just been said and taken back in the same breath. The next morning, Linda found him at the kitchen counter, coffee untouched, eyes distant. She tried again, gently. "Elvis, last night when you said you were watching for her." "What did you mean?" He looked up at her, tired but kind. "You wouldn't understand, honey," she pressed. "Is it about a fan?" He shook his head. "No, she was never a fan. That's when she saw it, his hand resting on the table, fingers tapping an invisible rhythm. On his pinky was a small gold ring engraved with the initials GLP, Gladys Love Presley. His mother. Linda said nothing. She'd heard him talk about his mama before, but never like this. There was something different in his tone. Reverent, almost childlike. Later that day, she walked past the staircase and glanced toward the hallway. On the windowsill sat a small silver locket. Inside was a faded photograph, Elvis as a boy, standing next to his mother outside their Tupelo home. It looked like it had been touched 1,000 times. That night, she asked the housekeeper, Nancy Rooks, if Elvis often stood by that window. Nancy nodded. "Every night," she said. "Same time. He don't like anyone to close that curtain. Says she wouldn't be able to see him if we do." Linda felt a chill. "See him from where?" Nancy hesitated. "He says from heaven." For days, Linda couldn't shake the image of him standing there, staring into the dark, waiting. She'd lie awake, listening for the sound of his footsteps on the wood floor. Sometimes she'd hear him whispering softly to the glass, like a prayer. Once she caught only a few words. "Are you proud of me, Mama?" It broke her. What would you do if the person you loved couldn't stop talking to someone who was gone? Would you tell them to let go? Or stand quietly beside them and listen? Linda chose to listen, but she wasn't ready for what came next. Because one night, when the moonlight hit the garden just right, she saw exactly what Elvis claimed he'd been watching for. And what she saw made her believe maybe he wasn't standing there alone after all. That summer night hung thick with heat. The cicadas were loud, the kind of sound that fills every empty space. The mansion slept, but upstairs one window glowed again. Linda lay awake staring at the ceiling. She told herself not to look, not to get pulled back into whatever haunted him. Yet when she heard that same low humming, she got up. Down the hallway, the faint notes of a piano drifted like smoke. Elvis was playing something soft, slow, and broken. When she reached the doorway, she froze. He wasn't at the piano anymore. He stood by the window, humming under his breath, hand pressed flat to the glass. Outside, the moon sat high, bright enough to turn the garden silver. And there, near the fountain, was a shadow. Still, human-shaped. Linda's breath caught. "Elvis," she whispered. "Someone's out there." He didn't flinch. "I know," he said quietly. "That's where she used to wave from." "Who?" she asked, though she already knew. "My mama." He smiled, a small, sad smile that made him look young again. "When I came home from tours, she'd wait right there. Used to tell me, 'Don't forget to look for me in the window light.'" Linda stared at him, then at the motionless shadow below. It didn't move, didn't fade. "Elvis, she's gone." "I know," he said. "But sometimes I think she comes back to check on me." He turned to her. "You ever feel like somebody you lost still finds you? Like they leave little signs so you won't quit?" Linda didn't answer. He went back to the piano, sat down, and played the same 4 notes, again and again, until the air felt heavy with memory. Each key sounded like a heartbeat trying to hold on. Outside, the garden lights flickered. The air smelled of rain, then lightning flashed. For a split second, Linda swore she saw a woman's outline, light dress, soft hair, standing exactly where he said his mother used to wave. When the flash faded, the figure was gone. "Elvis." He didn't look up. "I saw her too," he whispered. The room fell silent except for the ticking clock. He placed his hands on the keys again, but instead of playing he whispered a prayer. "Lord, tell Mama I'm still singing." That moment changed Linda. She stopped trying to fix him and started trying to understand him, because maybe grief isn't about letting go. Maybe it's about learning to live with the ghosts we love. The next morning, she went downstairs. The grass outside the window was wet from dew, and right where the shadow had stood, the ground was pressed flat, shaped like two footprints. She told no one, not even him. But later that day, while dusting the piano, she found something wedged beneath the keys. A small folded page, yellowed and torn. On it, written in Elvis's handwriting, were 4 words: "Still watching for her." It wasn't a song lyric, it was a promise, and that's when Linda realized the window wasn't just a habit, it was his way of keeping a vow. What would you hold on to if the world kept taking everything else? Because the next night, when she crept down the hall again, the window light was still burning, and this time she noticed something new on the sill that would change everything. The morning after that storm, the air in Graceland felt heavy, like the whole house had been holding its breath. Linda walked down the hallway, sunlight spilling through the curtains. On the windowsill where Elvis always stood, something caught her eye. A small black and white photograph tucked halfway behind a candle. It looked old, almost brittle with age. She picked it up carefully. It was Elvis as a boy, maybe 10 years old, holding his mother's hand outside their tiny Tupelo house. His hair was slicked back, his smile wide and innocent. Behind them stood a crooked wooden fence and a row of sunflowers bending toward the light. On the back of the photo, written in blue ink, were 5 words: "I still see you." "Mama!" Linda froze. She turned toward the hallway just as Elvis appeared, still in his robe, eyes tired but soft. "Where'd you find that?" he asked quietly. "Right here," she said. "Did you put it there?" He nodded slowly. "Been there a long time." He took the picture from her hands and stared at it for a while. Then he smiled, just barely. That was before any of this. Before the shows. Before the noise. He looked back at the window. "She used to stand out there waiting for me when I was just a kid with a guitar and a dream. Told me if I ever got lost, to look toward the light." He set the photo back on the sill, exactly where it had been. "Guess I'm still looking." Linda wanted to say something comforting, but the words wouldn't come. What could she possibly say to a man the world saw as immortal, yet who stood here searching for the one person who made him feel small enough to be human again? That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Elvis came back to that same spot. Linda watched from the hallway. He took out a notebook, flipped past pages of scribbled song lyrics, and tore out a blank sheet. With a shaking hand, he wrote a few lines, whispered them aloud, and slid the page under the photo. Later, when he left the room, Linda tiptoed forward. The ink was still wet. "When the lights go out, I'll see you in the dark. I'll keep the window open so you'll know the way back home." It wasn't a song, it was a prayer. That page stayed there for days, curling at the edges, soaking in the Memphis humidity. Sometimes, when the night air moved through the room, it would flutter, like someone was gently touching it. The staff said nothing. The maids cleaned around it. Even the guards began to whisper about the window ritual. One of them claimed he saw a faint reflection one night, 2 silhouettes instead of 1. No one wanted to talk about it. Not really, because to mention it out loud was to admit maybe Elvis wasn't just seeing shadows. Maybe he was keeping a promise, and the world would never know until the day that window lights suddenly went dark. After that note appeared, Graceland began to change, not in noise or schedule, but in mood. Every night, around 2 in the morning, the same quiet pattern repeated. The hall would creak, a faint piano chord, then light spilling through that upstairs window, glowing soft against the darkness. The guards called it the ritual. They said Elvis never missed a night, even on the evenings when his health was fading, when his knees ached and the pills made his hands shake. He still climbed those stairs, robe dragging across the carpet, until he reached that window. Linda asked him once why he kept doing it. He smiled. Because she waited for me every night of her life. Least I can do is wait for her now. Then he'd reach for the same photo, the one with the little boy and the woman with kind eyes, and place it on the sill. Next to it, a single candle. The flame trembled whenever he started to hum. Some nights, he'd hum "Take My Hand, Precious Lord." Other nights, "Peace in the Valley." Always gospel. Always the songs his mother had loved best. The housekeeper, Nancy Rooks, once said she heard him talking softly to the glass. Not prayers exactly, more like conversations. "Hey, Mama, you remember that day in Tupelo?" Or, "I sang that song for you tonight." And sometimes she swore she heard another voice answer, faint, like a hum carried on the wind. The next morning, Elvis would come down to breakfast quiet but calm, as if something inside him had been washed clean. Linda noticed the difference too. The man who spent his days restless and surrounded by noise would turn peaceful once the night came. The ritual wasn't superstition. It was survival. One evening, the piano tuner, a man named Ray, arrived after midnight to fix a broken key. He later told a friend that when he entered the room, Elvis didn't move or speak. He just stood by the window, candle burning low. Ray said he felt something in that room, like walking into someone's prayer. A few days later, Ray received a small envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a note on Graceland stationery. "Thank you for fixing her piano, EP." The next time Ray visited, he brought his teenage daughter with him. She said she saw the candlelight flicker behind the curtain as they left and thought she heard two voices singing. 2. Elvis's health was declining fast. He rarely left the mansion. Doctors came and went, but the ritual never stopped. Every night the same light burned until dawn, a small, trembling beacon in the dark. Maybe he was singing to heaven. Maybe heaven was singing back. Linda once told a reporter years later, that light wasn't for him, it was for her, so she'd know he never forgot. But in August of 1977, for the first time in years, the light didn't come on. The hallway stayed dark, the window black, and everyone in the house felt it, as if a part of Graceland itself had stopped breathing. August 15th, 1977. The day had been unusually quiet at Graceland. The staff said Elvis slept late, barely touched his lunch. The Memphis air was thick, still, unmoving, the kind of heat that makes the walls feel alive. As evening fell, the house settled into silence. No music, no footsteps, only the soft tick of that same clock down the hall. Linda remembered checking on him around midnight. He was sitting in bed, reading a small leather-bound Bible. When he looked up, his smile was tired but peaceful. "Don't stay up waiting," he told her. "I won't be long." She nodded and left the room, but when she woke again hours later, the light behind the window was still dark. The ritual had stopped. Downstairs, a guard named Al Strada said he'd noticed it too. "I thought the bulb burned out," he said later. But it wasn't the bulb. He just never turned it on. At 2:33 p.m. the next day, the world changed. News stations interrupted programs. Phones rang non-stop. Crowds gathered outside the gates. The king of rock and roll was gone. Inside the mansion, grief moved like a storm. Linda sat at the kitchen table shaking. Nancy Rooks made coffee no one drank. The air felt heavier than before, as if the light that used to live upstairs had gone out for good. Later that night, Vernon Presley went through his son's belongings, searching for anything personal to keep safe. On the bedside table, next to the Bible, he found a folded piece of paper. On it, written in that same familiar looping handwriting, were 4 words. "I can see her now." That was all. No signature, no explanation, just peace. Finally, when Linda heard about the note, she broke down. "He said he wouldn't be long," she whispered. "I just didn't know he meant forever." The next evening, as the sun set over Memphis, The crowd outside Graceland grew to thousands. People brought candles, flowers, guitars. They sang softly under the gate. Gospel songs, love songs, any song that once carried his voice. And then someone pointed up. The window, the one that had stayed dark the night before, flickered, just for a second. A faint, golden light shimmered behind the curtain. Then it disappeared. The crowd gasped. Some started to cry. Others whispered prayers. Reporters called it a trick of reflection, maybe a passing car or a street light. But the people who'd seen it swore it was something else, a sign. The newspapers the next morning ran headlines in bold, "Elvis gone at 42. But fans said that wasn't true. He hadn't gone. He'd gone home. Linda never went back to that room. The window remained closed. The candle melted to its base. But the photograph of the boy and his mother stayed there, just as he'd left it. Graceland became a shrine. Visitors lined up for hours, standing on that same lawn, looking up at that same window, waiting for a light that might flicker again. Because some stories don't end. They just fade into something softer. And that night, when the candle went out, the legend didn't die. It simply went quiet. Years passed. But that window at Graceland never stopped drawing people in. Even decades later, visitors swore that sometimes, late at night, a faint glow still appeared behind the curtain. Not bright, just soft, like a candle's memory. Tour guides said it was the reflection of streetlights. Fans disagreed. They said it was him. In 1985, a woman named Clara Boyd visited Graceland for the first time. She was 72 years old and had been at one of Elvis's first concerts in Memphis back in 1954. That night, she stood beneath the window and whispered, "You found her, didn't you?" Her grandson filmed her on an old camcorder. In the footage, the window above her flickered once, faint but visible. When the clip aired on local TV, thousands of fans started calling it the light of love. Soon, people began leaving notes and candles on the grass below that spot. Some wrote thank yous. Others wrote to lost parents, spouses, friends, anyone they still looked for in the dark. The ritual spread. Candlelight vigils every August 16th. Songs sung under the moonlight. Strangers standing shoulder to shoulder, whispering words they'd never said aloud. No one cared if the light was real or not. What mattered was what it meant. In 2017, 40 years after his passing, a small brass plaque was placed beneath that window. It reads, "For the one he waited for, and for everyone who still waits." It's easy to think of Elvis Presley as a legend, a voice, a symbol, an icon frozen in time. But the truth behind that window reminds us he was something simpler, a sun who never stopped waving back. And maybe that's why the light never truly went out. Some nights, when the Memphis sky is clear, the reflection of the moon lands perfectly on that glass. For just a moment, it looks like a face, gentle, smiling. Looking back at the crowd below, whether it's imagination or something more doesn't matter, because what Elvis left behind wasn't mystery. It was connection. He taught millions to dream, to sing, to love. But the window, that was his way of teaching us to remember. Because love doesn't die. It lingers, in songs, in memories, in quiet places where someone once stood waiting. Maybe that's why people still come, not just for him, but for the reminder that even legends long for the ones who made them feel human. The crowd leaves flowers. The wind moves the curtains. The house settles into silence, and the window glows again. If this story touched you, share it with someone you still think about. Someone whose light you still see in the dark. Because grief fades, but love leaves its lamp on forever. And maybe tonight, when you look toward your own window, you'll understand why Elvis never stopped looking back.